Good evening and welcome to City Limits. My name is Norm McCourt, your host of the show that provides you with information about the people, places, and events that shape the character of our community. Tonight we have a very special show that was taped at a recent BAMSL, which is the Bar Association of Metropolitan St. Louis Law Day event. It features the Missouri Secretary of State, Jason Kander, who, by the way, is the youngest elected statewide official in the United States. And his presentations, he speaks about two of his most passionate things that he's trying to get approved through the state legislature. One is the early voting initiative, and the second is ethics reform in the state of Missouri. Let's take a look.
And thank you to all of you for having me. It's an honor to be with you, to speak about a topic as important as voting rights and to do it on an occasion like Law Day. I really appreciate the opportunity. You know, this is a room of the best legal minds in this region. It's a room of the most dedicated public servants and community leaders. It's a pretty formidable group to talk about this topic. I was thinking about, the theme of Law Day, why every vote matters, and I was thinking about that theme and what I wanted to talk to such a formidable group of people about, and I decided really would just like to speak pretty plainly with you for a few minutes about some of the issues in Jefferson City that might be considered some of the more controversial issues in Jefferson City, but all three deal with this topic of why every vote matters. And so I don't get to make kind of deep policy dives very often, but I figure a room full of really smart lawyers is a pretty good place to do it. And so that's what I'm going to do, and I hope that if you agree with some of the things I say, that you'll talk to some of your state legislators and some of your friends and ask them to do the same. So first, when you're talking about this topic, you have to talk about a constitutional right that is frankly under attack in Jefferson City right now. And that's the right to vote in the state. It's under attack right now. And as the state's chief election official, it's my job to advocate for eligible Missouri voters. And I view that role as two major functions. One is to make sure that only eligible voters vote, but also to make sure that every eligible voter has the opportunity to vote. And that second part is maybe a little more controversial in Jefferson City right now, because unfortunately, there are folks in your state capital who are pretty dedicated, who are working pretty hard to make it harder, if not impossible, for a lot of eligible registered Missouri voters to cast their ballot. Obviously, I'm talking about the photo ID legislation that's been proposed in Missouri this year. So I want to dive into it for a second, because there's things you need to know about it, because there's a lot of rhetoric, but there are some details that everybody needs to know. This year's proposed photo ID legislation in Jefferson City, if it were to pass and become law, it would be the most extreme law of its type in the entire country. If it were to pass, it could disenfranchise 220,000 registered eligible Missouri voters, people who are registered to vote right now. That number is equivalent to 8% of the overall amount of people who actually voted for president in Missouri in 2012. So I'll say it again because it sounds like the kind of thing that a politician says out of hyperbole, but it's clearly true. If it were to pass, it would be the most extreme law of its type in the entire country. And frankly, calling it a photo ID law almost underplays what it really is. It almost doesn't fairly describe it. Because what it really is a law that requires one very specific form of identification in order to vote. No longer would you be able to use a student ID to vote. You wouldn't be able to use the voter identification card that you received in the mail before Election Day. You wouldn't be able to use an expired driver's license. As if there is something more accurate about a driver's license, a photo ID from the government that has your address, your name, and everything else, as if it's more accurate if it hasn't expired, right? You wouldn't be able to use any of those items. I wouldn't be able to use my military ID, which, like a lot of veterans, I still carry. It expired about 6 months ago, but it's issued to me by the United States Army. Has my it's a very unhappy looking photo, but it's me. And if it were to pass in 2016, I wouldn't be able to present that ID and pick a president because it expired in November of 2013. So it's a pretty extreme step. And one other thing you should know is that, as I mentioned, this law wouldn't allow you to use student IDs. In Wisconsin, they have a photo ID law. In Wisconsin, they aren't quite as restrictive. They allow you to use your student ID. On Tuesday, a federal court struck down the Wisconsin photo ID law and said that it was unconstitutional because it was too burdensome. So I think we can see sort of how it stacks up and what the most extreme law of this type in the country, what sort of fate it would mean. But another result sort of a common sense result of these arbitrary requirements is that how many of you, when you have gone to vote, you have noticed that there are people, maybe in some cases it's you, who, when they walk into their polling place, the election workers know them, right? They call them by their name because they've been voting there for years. A lot of the time these are senior citizens. And then, because this is what the law requires right now, even though they walk in and someone calls them by their name, they then present identification anyway, because that's what the law requires. If this law were to pass, immediately those folks, many of them, thousands of them, would be disenfranchised. And even though they would walk into their polling place and the person right there would recognize them and they would have identification with them, they wouldn't have the kind of identification that our state legislature, that very narrow form, says that they must have. So they couldn't vote. That's pretty obviously wrong. My grandfather is 90 years old. Many people in my family, including myself, have been trying to persuade him that perhaps he doesn't need to drive anymore. All right? I call him Pop. And I told him that the rule, I said, Pop, the rule is whatever gesture anybody makes on the road, just assume they're saying, I'm going. You win. He said he's going to start following that rule. He had a fender bender a couple weeks ago. The thing is, a lot of people my grandfather's age are thinking about maybe giving up their driver's license. Maybe they're not going to drive anymore. And probably their grandkids might be trying to persuade them to do that. I don't think it's right that they should then have to consider the possibility that if they do that, they might not be able to vote. My grandfather served in World War II. Whether he still has a driver's license that's not expired or not shouldn't have anything to do with whether or not he can cast a ballot to pick a president or a secretary of state, whether it's his grandson or not. So it's wrong, and it's also blatantly unconstitutional. It's so unconstitutional, in fact, that the only way that they can pass the most extreme photo ID law in the country in this state is to actually amend the state constitution. That's a pretty good indication that it's an unconstitutional law, because what a lot of people may not realize is that Missouri, in our state constitution, actually has one of the strongest voting rights provisions of any state constitution in the entire country. One of the strongest provisions, and with one House joint resolution, one constitutional amendment, there are members in the legislature who want to pull that back. They want to get rid of that distinction. I happen to think that we should be proud of the fact that we have one of the strongest voting rights provisions in a state constitution anywhere in the country. I'm proud of that fact as the chief election official. And don't let the rhetoric out there fool you. There's a lot of rhetoric on the issue. Folks will say, well, you need a photo ID to check into a hotel. And you need a photo ID to rent a car. You need a photo ID to get on an airplane. That is true. But it's not a constitutional right that you get to do any of those things. None of those things are constitutional rights. Voting is the foundation of our democracy, and we don't put it at the same standard, at the same level that we put whether or not you can get on an airplane. It's just simply not what we do. And if you don't agree with anything I just said, let me at least tell you that in the state of Missouri, we have never had a case of voter impersonation fraud. That's the only kind that even the proponents of this legislation claim that it could actually prevent, is voter impersonation fraud, and we've never had a case of it. But it risks potentially disenfranchising 220,000 registered Missouri voters. So rather than weakening our state's constitution by amending it and by making it possible to put through the most extreme law of this type in the country, I actually think that where our priority ought to be is on strengthening voting rights in our state and on making it more convenient for eligible voters to vote. I think that ought to be the objective, and that's why I wholeheartedly support early voting and why I think we need to get it done in Missouri as soon as possible. And I believe this so strongly that one of the very first things I did as Secretary of State was, on the first day that I took office, we put together, we announced we would form an early voting commission. And so it was a bipartisan group of folks, elected officials, local election authorities, citizens from all across the state, to come together and look at the issue of early voting and figure out what's the best way for Missouri to do this. What's the Missouri way to do early voting? They came up with 3 really common sense ideas that I want to share with you, and that I hope you share with your neighbors, your friends, and your state legislators. And it's 3 things. First, making sure that there's a 6-week period where you can go in and vote prior to Election Day. Second, making sure that if you want to vote absentee, by mail for instance, you don't have to state an excuse. And then third, saying that in the most populated election jurisdictions, like right here in St. Louis, that there would be at least one satellite voting location where you could go to vote. There are 35 states who have some form of no excuse advance voting, meaning we're one of 15 that don't. So we are long past the times when this issue was controversial or cutting edge. It is not a controversial issue anymore, and it's time that we had early voting in Missouri, because implementation of the recommendations of my early voting commission would make a real difference in the lives of Missourians. And it's a practical difference. It's an everyday difference. It's the idea that they could go to vote, hardworking Missourians could go to vote, and maybe they don't have to stand in line for hours. Like the gentleman that I met on Election Day in 2012, who was there for the 3rd time and left because he had to get back to work. But he promised me he'd come back a 4th time, because his boss, I guess, had decided to do that. That's important. Not everybody's boss is going to place that fundamental right at that level. So we got to make sure that they have every opportunity to exercise their right to vote. We got to make sure that they shouldn't have to miss an hour's wages, that they shouldn't have to arrange childcare to exercise their fundamental rights. And that's what early voting can do. Because to me, making it easier for eligible voters to actually exercise their right to vote is just common sense. Some of you may know that there are multiple proposals now being pushed back and forth in Jefferson City on early voting. And I'm often asked if there's one I prefer. And my answer is really simple. I'm for early voting, period, and I think that we need to get it done, one way or the other. And frankly, you can't talk about these issues, about threats to our democracy in Missouri, without talking about what I consider to be one of the greatest forms of election fraud in our state. And that is the fact that we have the worst campaign finance and ethics laws in the entire country. So I'm going to say that one again too, because that really sounds like something that comes out of like the hyperbole basket that a politician says, right? Like the worst campaign finance and ethics laws in the entire country. But I'm going to prove it to you, because it's absolutely true. We are the only state in the entire country that has the combination of no limit on the contributions that folks can give to candidates for office, and also no limit on the lobbyist gifts, the gifts that can come from lobbyists to lawmakers and elected officials. We're the only state with that combination. I don't think that's a distinction we should really work to hold on to. And our legislature, frankly, has danced around this fact for a real long time. They have acted as though there's nothing they can do about it. They've acted as if it's inertia, it's the status quo, it's beyond their control. And Missourians, I think, have really started to really realize that it's not beyond their control. And Missourians are tired of the dance. They're tired of them pretending that there's nothing they can do. And they're eager for them to take action. I've been fighting for reform like this since I arrived in Jeff City in the first place. And this session, my office worked with a state representative named Kevin McManus, and we put forward a proposal on campaign finance and ethics reform that I'm going to tell you a little bit about, because I hope you talk to your state legislators about it. What it is, let me first tell you what it's not. It is not a compromise that's been worked out by both parties to make everybody happy. Because you can't actually fix the worst campaign finance and ethics laws in the country with a compromise that's been negotiated by politicians. You can really only fix them with an actual solution. And that's why the bill that we put forward, really there's something in there for politicians of every party to dislike, which is how you know it's actual campaign finance and ethics reform. And so I'm going to tell you the 3 guiding principles of it. It's got 57 different provisions, and I'm not going to get into all of them, but I'll tell you the 3 guiding principles. The first is effective and enforceable campaign contribution limits. Second, placing a more appropriate and professional distance between lawmakers and lobbyists. And then third, an ethics commission, the body that regulates lobbying and campaigns in the state, that is empowered to effectively and vigorously apply these new laws. So I'm going to go through each of them real quick. First, effective and enforceable campaign contribution limits. This is really simple. We need campaign contribution limits in our state. We need them to be restored, but we have to be intellectually honest about the fact that politicians have a tendency to find ways around limits like that. And so we have to also have a ban on political money laundering. We have to ban the process of allowing people to put a contribution into a committee called Missourians for Great Things, and then have that make a contribution to Missourians for really amazingly great things, and so on and so forth, until it reaches a candidate's campaign committee. We need to ban that practice, and we need effective campaign contribution limits. Second, we need that more appropriate distance in our state. This is another really important part of sort of this theme, the health of our democracy in our state. We need that more appropriate distance between lawmakers and lobbyists. And there's a couple ways you do that. The first is we have to close what I call the revolving door that exists in Jefferson City. This is the loophole in the law that allows someone to be a legislator on a Thursday and a lobbyist on a Friday, to go right back and get paid to lobby the very same people that they were just working with. Next, we need to ban all state elected officials from receiving any gifts from lobbyists. You know, everything from a cup of coffee to a Cardinals game. And the reason that we need that is not just appearances. It's the simple fact that it's not too much to ask of those of us in elected office to actually do what our constituents do, which is go to a ball game or go to a restaurant and spend money out of our own pockets. That's what Missourians want. A recent poll said 80% of Missourians want that. I don't think that's too much to ask, and you can't justify these lobbyist gifts. There's no way to justify it. So don't get me wrong, it's really easy for politicians to give speeches where they vilify lobbyists and special interests. Like, that is about the easiest speech in the world to give, and just about every politician has given it. And I want to be really clear, that's not actually the speech I'm giving. And the reason is that, ironically, if you talk to lobbyists in Jefferson City, and then you poll them, and then you poll legislators, ethics reform and campaign finance reform is a lot more popular among the lobbyists in Jefferson City than it is among the lawmakers. I put this burden, I put this responsibility on the lawmakers, because as much as they may want to throw up their hands and go home to their districts and say the reason that this isn't happening is because the special interests and the lobbyists just won't let it happen, none of those people that they're talking about actually have a vote in the state legislature. They have a vote. They have the ability to get this done. And the dance goes on right now, and we need to put a stop to it. It needs to end. Finally, the last provision of it is that we have to empower the Ethics Commission to vigorously and effectively enforce these new laws. If you're going to have strict new laws, you need the tools to enforce them, you need the resources to enforce them. In the heat of an election year, candidates may make the decision to break the rules in the run-up to the election, in the last days before the election, during their campaign. And they figure, well, I'll deal with the consequences afterwards, right? I don't think that that should be okay. And that's why it's my belief, and it's why the legislation that we put forward says that if you do that, you're undeserving of the ballot. And so what it would do is it would say in certain circumstances, the Missouri Ethics Commission could act if you violate the law in that way at the last minute and actually remove your name from the ballot. For the simple reason that crime shouldn't pay and cheaters shouldn't be allowed to compete. Now, under current law, the surest way to escape punishment from the few laws that the Ethics Commission does have to actually enforce is to lie to the Ethics Commission, is to obstruct an Ethics Commission investigation. This is like my exhibit A as to how terrible the ethics and campaign finance laws are in our state. Because as you all know, at the federal level, if the Federal Election Commission comes knocking on your door and they're investigating you, you tell the truth or you go to jail. In the state of Missouri, our laws have created an incentive to just lie to the Ethics Commission or to obstruct an investigation because there's no law against it. We need to criminalize obstructing an Ethics Commission investigation or lying to an Ethics Commission investigator. Finally, I believe that those who break the law in Missouri, in terms of ethics laws and campaign laws, that they should be the ones responsible for paying for a more robust Ethics Commission. And so I would like to see us create the Missouri Ethics Commission Enforcement Fund, which would take 50% of the penalties and the fines that are assessed by the Ethics Commission and put those toward the growth of the Ethics Commission to meet these new requirements. That's important not just because it doesn't use your tax dollars to police the games the politicians play with one another, but it's also important because right now, the Ethics Commission has to go every year before the House and Senate budget committees and the legislature as a whole and ask that it be funded and its existence continue, which just happens to be the exact same people that it's tasked with regulating and policing. That doesn't make a lot of sense. And everything we can do to make them independent of the people who control their purse strings, I think is a step in the right direction for that foundation of democracy in our state. So by passing meaningful campaign finance and ethics reform, lawmakers have a chance to actually live up to what their constituents expected of them when they elected them in the first place. They have the opportunity to be worthy of the people of Missouri, and if they don't like that as a reason, they should just consider the fact that Missourians want this and they deserve nothing less than this. They are the worst campaign finance and ethics laws in the country, and they need to change. Now, reporters and other politicians and grassroots supporters of this idea, they ask me all the time, what do you think the likelihood is of this actually passing, right? Of you getting a legislative body to sort of police itself? Because, as we all know, there's no interest group in Jefferson City called Big Ethics, right? You can't guarantee your re-election by doing the bidding and carrying the water of Big Ethics. They will not rain contributions down upon you if you do it. So people ask me that all the time, whether I'm optimistic. And you'd be surprised, my answer is actually yes, because something has happened over the last few years in Jefferson City, and that is that this conversation has changed. It used to be a conversation about whether or not we need campaign finance and ethics reform. Now it seems to be a conversation about what kind of campaign finance and ethics reform we need. And I think that's important, and our rather strident and ambitious proposal actually received a hearing in a House committee this year, which, is not something my mom's gonna put on her fridge, okay? But in a very partisan body, that's a pretty big deal. And, you know, what I'm not telling you is that bipartisan acknowledgement of the problem, diagnosis of the issue, without treating the symptoms as some, you know, running through the tape on the finish line. It's not. It's a first step, but it's an important first step. And you know that those of you in this room, you play a pretty huge role in this, in advocating for this issue, and advocating for all three of the issues that I've talked about today. This is, as I said, a collection of some of Missouri's best legal minds, the most dedicated public servants and community leaders. You are the people who care the most about justice and about the welfare of our state. And that's why, really, I'm here today to ask you for your help. I'm here to ask you to push for this kind of meaningful reform, to push for more access to the ballot, to push for not dismantling the voting rights provisions of our Constitution. And really, you know, for all the jokes out there about lawyers, and there are plenty, the fact is that people listen to you because you're a lawyer. You know, when you talk to your neighbor about something that was in the paper, whether you realize it or not, they go to church on Sunday or they go to work the next morning, and when the topic comes up, they say, well, you know, my neighbor said this, and he or she is a lawyer. I know this for a fact because when I served in the Missouri House, people would get up on the floor and they would say terrible things about lawyers. And then they would walk over to me and they would say, I'm not a lawyer, can you explain this to me? And so I hope that you will stand with me in supporting these things. I hope that you will talk with your neighbors about it. I hope you will talk with your coworkers and your state legislators about it. I hope that you will start awkward conversations at the grocery store in line about these topics, because that's what has to happen for us to make sure that we do what we need to do, which is to preserve our state's constitution, to expand access to the ballot in our state, and to make sure that we have the kind of comprehensive reforms that really uphold the foundation of democracy in our state. So thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Hope you enjoyed the 2014 Law Day, sponsored by BAMSL. And if you wanted to contact Jason Kander, you have the information up on the screen. Thank you for watching our show this evening. If you have any questions, please contact me at www.cityofblackjack.com, or you can call me at area code 314-355-0400, extension 100. Thank you. Good evening.